The soil carbon readings came back at levels the instruments almost couldn't register. The researchers ran the calibration sequence twice, then a third time. Before they entertained the possibility that the numbers were real, they assumed the equipment had failed, because what the data was describing wasn't a degraded Texas scrubland anymore. It was something closer to the ancient prairie that had existed here before anyone alive could remember it. 5,000 bison, a few years of open range, and a landscape that had spent decades dying was, by every chemical and biological measure available, coming back to life faster than the models said was possible. What those scientists actually found, in the soil, in the root systems, in the water table beneath the cracked hardpan, is a story about an animal that doesn't just live on a landscape. It rebuilds one. And the deeper question, the one this whole project raised and couldn't quite answer yet, is why? What exactly are bison doing that a tractor, a seeder, or a century of careful land management simply cannot? To understand what bison do to a landscape, you have to go back further than the Texas experiment. You have to go back 10,000 years to a continent that had never known a plow. At their peak, somewhere between 40 and 60 million bison moved across the interior of North America in a pattern that looked chaotic from the ground and deliberate from above. They grazed a section of grassland hard, then moved on, giving it months to recover before any animal returned. That rhythm, graze, trample, move, rest, is not incidental to how the Great Plains formed. It is how the Great Plains formed. Their hooves broke open compacted soil, driving rainfall down into root zones instead of letting it run off. Their dung seeded millions of acres with nitrogen the grasses couldn't produce on their own. And then there were the wallows, shallow depressions worn into the earth by bison rolling, over and over, generation after generation, coating themselves in dust and mud. Those wallows filled with rain. They held water through dry months. Across the entire interior of the continent, bison wallows became the primary source of wetland habitat, breeding grounds for insects, amphibians, and migratory birds that would have had nowhere else to go. An animal scratching its back built an ecosystem's water infrastructure. This was not one species living inside an ecosystem. This was one species manufacturing it, continuously, for millennia. Which makes the next question almost uncomfortable to sit with. If bison built all of this, what exactly happened to the land when they were gone? They were gone in less than 20 years. 60 million animals, an estimated 60 million, reduced to fewer than 1,000 by 1889. The hunters worked by rail, shooting from moving cars, leaving carcasses to rot in lines across the plains. The federal government didn't just permit it. Officials actively encouraged it, understanding that destroying the bison meant destroying the way of life of the plains nations who depended on them. The extinction of the herd was policy before it was catastrophe. But the catastrophe came, just not in a way anyone recognized as one. Without bison, the grasses changed first. The deep-rooted native species, the ones that had co-evolved with 60 million large bodies, began losing ground to shallower, less resilient plants. Without hooves breaking the soil surface, rainfall started sheeting off instead of soaking in. Without dung, the nitrogen cycle slowed, the wallows stopped filling, the wetlands dried. Insects lost their breeding grounds. The birds that followed the insects lost theirs. Each loss was quiet. Each looked local. Together, they were a continent-scale unraveling, moving in slow motion, decades long, invisible to anyone watching only a single piece of it. Within 2 decades of the last great herds vanishing, the first dust conditions were already forming on the southern plains. Not the Dust Bowl people remember from photographs that came in the 1930s. These were the precursors, appearing in the 1890s, 40 years earlier, while the soil was still trying to hold itself together without the animals that had held it for 10,000 years. So when people today talk about rewilding bison, returning them to Texas, to the Great Plains, to the places they once built, the real question underneath all of it isn't just whether we can bring the animal back. It's whether an ecosystem that came apart across 150 years can actually be rewound. That question found an answer, or the beginning of one, on a stretch of ranch land in the Texas Panhandle, where a coalition nobody expected spent 3 years quietly building the largest bison reintroduction the state had ever attempted. The coalition was strange by design. Ranchers who had run cattle on this land for generations, conservation biologists from 3 universities, and indigenous land managers from the Comanche Nation, whose ancestors had followed these animals across this same ground for centuries before the slaughter. Each group came in with different reasons. None of them fully trusted the others at first. The land they chose was not the romantic version of the Texas plains. It had been grazed hard by cattle for over 100 years, and the damage ran deep. When soil scientists ran their tests before the first bison arrived, they found almost no microbial life in the top layers. Not depleted, absent. Biologically, it was closer to gravel than to prairie. The organisms that break down organic matter, that pull nitrogen through the soil, that make a grassland a living system rather than just ground, they were gone. Which raised a question nobody had a clean answer to. Bison reshape ecosystems by reading them, wallowing where moisture pools, grazing in patterns that respond to what the land offers back. But what happens when the land has forgotten the language? Will bison behave differently on ground that holds no memory of what they are? The answer came slowly, and it started not with behavior but with biology. Before asking what bison would do on dead ground, the scientists needed to understand what bison actually are to a grassland, not ecologically, chemically. Cattle graze by cropping. They bite, they take, and the plant spends the next several weeks simply recovering from the removal. Net result over time: less root mass, thinner sod, ground that retreats from the animal that feeds on it. Bison graze differently, and the difference is not subtle. Bison's saliva contains compounds that actively stimulate grassroot growth. The act of being eaten by a bison triggers the plant to produce more biomass, not less. But grass does not retreat, it responds. One study found that grasses grazed by bison produced root systems measurably denser than ungrazed controls nearby. The animal and the plant are not in opposition. They are running a transaction that has been refined across millions of years. Which raises something harder to answer. If grazing at the surface can stimulate growth downward into the roots, what does that do to the soil beneath? What happens to microbial communities when they suddenly have more root mass feeding them, more carbon moving through the system? That question was sitting right underneath the bison that were about to arrive. And underneath that question was the one the ecologists had been carrying since day one. Would bison, shaped by living grassland, behave the same on ground that had forgotten what they are? The soil question had an answer. It just took years to see it clearly. What the researchers found below the surface wasn't a slow incremental shift. It was a cascade. When bison graze, they don't just clip the grass, they drive energy down. More root turnover means more carbon feeding directly into the microbial layer. Bacteria and fungi that had been operating at low capacity, holding a kind of metabolic baseline in degraded ground, started multiplying. The fungal networks, the same networks that move nutrients between plants, that let one root system essentially share resources with another, began extending. Not metaphorically, measurably in core samples pulled from the same plots, year after year. But it wasn't just root carbon driving the change. A single bison deposits roughly 65 pounds of dung per day. Across a herd of thousands moving through a landscape, that is a fertilization event the scale of which no agricultural system has ever matched per acre. Nitrogen, phosphorus, microbial inoculants from partially digested plant matter, deposited in clumps, in patterns, concentrated in ways that create hotspots of biological activity across the soil profile. Urine adds a separate nitrogen pulse. Hooves press organic material into the ground and break up the crust that had been sealing moisture out. The underground economy was reopening for business. And when an underground economy recovers, what it eventually produces shows up on the surface. What shows up on the surface first isn't grass, it's water. Or rather, the absence of what had been taking water away. The hoof action that was breaking up that surface crust, doing it across thousands of acres repeatedly, season after season, was quietly rewriting how rain behaved when it hit the ground. Instead of sheeting off compacted soil and carrying topsoil with it into gullies, water was pausing, sinking in, finding channels through soil structure that bison traffic had reopened. The wallowing is part of this too. When a bison drops its full weight and rolls, and a bull can exceed 2,000 pounds, it creates a shallow depression that catches rainfall and holds it long enough to infiltrate. Thousands of these depressions, scattered across a landscape, function like a slow-release system. The land begins to bank water instead of spending it immediately downstream. On one Texas restoration site, researchers recorded something that stopped them cold: stream flow. In dry season months, in a creek that had run bone dry for decades. The bison hadn't brought rain. The rainfall data was ordinary. What they had rebuilt was the land's water memory, its capacity to receive, hold, and slowly release what the sky was already giving it. That creek running again in August wasn't just a hydrological curiosity. Water is a signal, and where water goes in a recovering landscape, it doesn't travel alone. What followed the water in was life that nobody had put there. Prairie species, native grasses and wildflowers that hadn't been recorded on the site in living memory began reappearing in the grazed zones. Not planted, not seeded from a bag, just returning, as if the land had remembered instructions it had been holding in reserve. The mechanism isn't mysterious once you know how bison move. Their hooves break soil crust and create small depressions, microhabitats that collect moisture, shelter seeds from wind, hold organic material. Their grazing doesn't strip a plant, it triggers it. Many native grasses evolved specifically to be grazed hard and recover fast, and decades of cattle or no grazing at all had tilted the competitive landscape toward the species that didn't need that trigger. Bison reset the balance. In year 3 of one Texas restoration, botanists documented a grass species that had not been recorded anywhere in that county for over 80 years. They hadn't introduced it. Nobody had. Its seeds had apparently been sitting in the soil the entire time, dormant, waiting for exactly the conditions a bison herd creates. 80 years of patience in the dark. That finding changed how researchers thought about the soil beneath their feet. It wasn't just dirt. It was an archive, and the bison were reading it. But the grasses coming back were only the first signal, because where plants return, something else starts watching. The plants came back first, but something was watching, and it arrived faster than almost anyone predicted. Insects found the restored patches within weeks. Not just any insects. Specialist species, the ones tied to specific native grasses and forbs that hadn't been available in that landscape for generations. Monarchs moving through Texas started pausing longer in restoration zones. Native bee surveys turned up species that had been functionally absent from surrounding agricultural land. The question researchers kept asking was simple: are these animals following the plants? The answer, it turned out, was yes, but the sequence was more intricate than a single chain of cause and effect. The dung beetle signal was the one that stopped people cold. Within 18 months at the Texas site, dung beetle diversity had climbed to levels that researchers typically only document in intact African savannas. Not degraded African savannas, intact ones. The beetles were processing waste, aerating soil, cycling nutrients at a rate the land hadn't seen in over a century. Birds followed the beetles. Small mammals followed the birds, or followed the insects directly. Grassland sparrows reappeared, then kestrels. Ecologists recognized the sequence. It matched the rebuilding patterns pulled from ancient prairie records. The same cascade, playing out again on the same soil, which raised a question that had nothing to do with birds or beetles. If the entire food web was reconstructing itself from the ground up, what did that mean at the scale of the climate? What it meant at the climate scale turned out to be something that most climate scientists hadn't been looking for, because they'd been looking in the wrong places. The dominant carbon sequestration models are built around trees. Plant forests, capture carbon, done. It's intuitive, it's measurable, and it's almost certainly incomplete. Because the deep root systems of native grasses, the kind bison maintain through grazing, sequester carbon differently than trees do. They drive carbon underground, past the shallow soil layers where it can escape back into the atmosphere, and push it into stable mineral horizons that lock it away for centuries. Bison accelerate this. Their hooves break soil crust, letting rainfall and root matter penetrate. Their grazing stimulates new root growth, and new root growth means new carbon pulled from the air and pressed into the earth. Their dung feeds the microbiome that stabilizes it all. No machinery, no energy input. The bison are the machine. A 2023 study ran the numbers on what full restoration across their historic range would actually deliver. The estimate: carbon sequestration equivalent to removing 100 million cars from the road, not as a one-time offset, but permanently, every year. That number is large enough to make people uncomfortable. Because if it's real, and the researchers behind it stand by the methodology, then the obvious question isn't scientific, it's political. If this works, why isn't it already happening everywhere? The answer to that question is partly political, partly economic, and partly a matter of who already owns the land. But before we get there, the science underneath it deserves a real look. Because the comparison between bison and cattle isn't just about numbers of animals or acres grazed. The two species interact with the land through fundamentally different mechanics. Take hooves. A cow's hoof is narrow and concentrated. The pressure it delivers to the soil surface exceeds what a tractor puts down. And over time, that pressure seals the ground. It creates a crust that sheds water instead of absorbing it, compresses the pore structure that roots need, and drives out the soil organisms that make fertility possible. Walk a heavily grazed cattle pasture after rain, and watch the water pool and run. The soil is closed. A bison's hoof is wider, splayed, built to distribute weight across softer prairie ground. And when bison move in herds, those hooves don't seal, they punch. Small aeration holes, thousands per acre, that let water in and give roots a path. The land breathes differently under them. One system extracts, the other builds while it feeds. That's not a difference of degree, it's a difference in direction, which raises the harder question. Could cattle ranchers borrow some of what bison do naturally, or is the gap biological and unavoidable? That question has a more complicated answer than either side usually admits. So could cattle ranchers close that gap? Some are trying. The movement is called regenerative ranching, and its core insight is deceptively simple. The problem was never really the cow. It was how the cow was managed. Conventional grazing leaves cattle on the same land for months. They circle the same grass, bite the same stems down to the root, compact the same soil. The prairie never gets the rest it needs to regenerate. But a growing number of ranchers are experimenting with something different, moving their herds fast, intensively, then pulling them out completely and letting the land sit. The results have genuinely surprised researchers. In some cases, soil organic matter climbs, grass diversity recovers, ground cover thickens, not to the level bison achieve on their own, but measurably closer. Here is the key variable, and it matters more than most people realize. It is not the animal, it is the duration of stay. Bison moved constantly across the plains, not because they were ecologically virtuous, but because predators kept them moving. It was that movement, the brief, intense disturbance followed by a long recovery, that the soil was actually built for. The species was almost incidental, which means the cow can approximate the effect if the rancher approximates the pressure. Not perfectly, but enough to shift the direction. But that raises something deeper. If movement was the mechanism, and predators created the movement, then what happened when the wolves disappeared from this landscape? And does that absence change the math for everything that followed? The wolves disappeared from most of the Great Plains by the early 20th century. Hunted, poisoned, trapped, gone within a few decades of the bison slaughter that preceded them. And here's what that sequence reveals. The bison did not create the grazing pattern on their own. The wolves created the pressure that created the pattern. The bison were the instrument. The predators were the hand playing it. When researchers began reintroducing bison to protected areas, without also restoring predator populations, something predictable happened. Within a few years, grazing behavior drifted. The herds lingered. They returned to the same patches. The churning, moving, soil-building rhythm broke down, and the land began showing the same overgrazing signatures you see in poorly managed cattle operations. The wolves were not a bonus feature of the old ecosystem. They were load-bearing. Remove them and the whole mechanism softens, which puts the restoration movement against a harder question than bison numbers or herd size. Full ecological function, the kind that built the deep prairie soils, may require predators on the landscape, not as a symbol, as a working part of the system. And that is where the science stops being purely scientific. Because wolves on a working landscape means wolves near livestock. It means a conversation about land sovereignty, about who bears the cost of restoration and who gets to decide. That conversation is not settled. It is barely started. That conversation about who decides, it has an answer that Western institutions keep finding inconvenient. Tribal nations were not waiting for the science to catch up. Several of them never let the bison go in the first place. Through the near-extinction years, while commercial hunters were reducing 60 million animals to fewer than 1,000, nations including the Lakota, the Blackfeet, and the Comanche were holding on to small herds, deliberately, at real cost, against enormous pressure to let it go. Not as a ranching operation, as an act of refusal. They already understood what the bison did to the land because they had watched it happen across generations, in granular detail that no field study runs long enough to replicate. When Western ecologists began documenting how bison wallows create wetland microhabitats, or how selective grazing pressure triggers specific grass responses, tribal land managers recognized descriptions of things their communities had known and worked with for centuries. The scientists were not discovering, they were arriving late, which raises the sharpest version of the question this whole movement keeps circling. What does land sovereignty actually mean when the land in question is the land that was taken? The restoration conversation cannot be only about bison behavior and soil carbon. Not honestly, because the people who carry the longest and most precise knowledge of how to do this right are also the people who were removed from the landscape in the first place. So here is the number that should stop the conversation cold. All the conservation herds in North America, the national parks, the tribal lands, the ranches running bison under restoration frameworks, total roughly 30,000 animals. The pre-collapse population was 60 million. That means every bison alive in a conservation program today represents a rounding error on what was lost. The current restoration effort, in its entirety, is about 0.05% of what existed before the slaughter. Not 50%, not 5%. 0.05%. The scale of the loss and the scale of the response are not even in the same conversation yet. And the land question is just as stark. The most ambitious restoration projects operate on thousands of acres. The historic bison range covered roughly 500 million. You can do the math, but the math almost doesn't matter. The gap is so large that matching the order of magnitude feels like a different century's problem, not this one's. Which is where the whole movement hits its hardest wall. Is there a realistic path to anything that functions at real ecological scale? Or is what we're doing always going to be a demonstration? A proof of concept with no mechanism to become the concept itself? Because bison can do everything the science says they can do. The question is whether the conditions exist to let them do it at a size that moves the needle. The question of whether scale is achievable turns out to have an answer, but it comes from an unexpected direction, not from conservation biologists or rewilding advocates. It comes from people who manage money, risk, and infrastructure. And what they're finding is that bison restoration pencils out in ways that straight conservation spending almost never does. Water authorities in the Central Plains have started running the numbers on what restored prairie upstream does to their flood control costs downstream. The results are not marginal. One watershed study found that bison-grazed prairie upstream reduced flood damage costs downstream by an amount that exceeded the entire cost of the restoration program. Within 6 years. Not over a century. Not over a generation. 6 years. That is the kind of return that doesn't need a conservation argument. It needs a spreadsheet. Insurance actuaries are reaching similar conclusions about drought resilience. Ranchers operating under bison restoration frameworks are carrying less debt through dry years than neighboring cattle operations, because the land underneath them is holding more water. The economic case is not being built by people trying to save the bison. It is being built by people trying to save money, which reframes the scale problem entirely. Because if the financial logic is sound, the limiting factor isn't ideology or ambition. So what is it? The limiting factor is not money. It is not science. It is not even politics in the conventional sense. It is something older and harder to shift, a story that the American West has been telling itself for 150 years, about what belongs on its land and what doesn't. Cattle built the cultural identity of the Great Plains. The rancher, the fence line, the herd of Angus or Hereford. These are not just economic choices, they're symbols. And bison in that mythology are wild, unpredictable, something that was replaced for a reason. The resistance to restoration is not always articulated as hostility. It surfaces as skepticism about fencing costs, liability questions, concerns about neighboring land. But underneath most of those objections is something simpler. This isn't how we do things here. And then there is the law. In several Great Plains counties, local ordinances technically classify bison as wildlife rather than livestock, which means they are legally ungrazable on private land. In the very region bison spent 10,000 years building, the legal code treats them as trespassers. A landowner who wants to restore bison faces the same permitting burden as someone trying to keep a wild predator. The economics can pencil out perfectly, and it still doesn't matter if the zoning says no. So the question is whether anything is actually moving this. Whether the Texas desert turning green is the kind of story that reaches beyond conservation circles and starts shifting what people believe is possible. What the future of this actually looks like. Here is what the Texas site looks like now. Not in photographs taken to make donors feel good, in peer-reviewed measurement. The bison came into degraded caliche hardpan, into ground that had been chemically sealed for decades, and the restoration team documented everything. Soil carbon, water infiltration, species counts, root depth. Year by year, the numbers moved. That much was expected. What was not expected was the final measurement that silenced the room. Plant species richness on the restored site now exceeds what's recorded in the oldest ecological surveys of undisturbed Texas prairie. The land didn't just recover, it surpassed. Whatever the soil remembered, whatever biology was locked in that hardpan waiting, the bison unlocked more of it than the baseline ever held. That result changes the question. It's no longer whether broken land can come back. It's whether broken land has been quietly carrying biological potential, that undisturbed land, never stressed into dormancy, never triggered. The desert wasn't empty, it was waiting. Whether that idea, that specific, verifiable, peer-reviewed idea, travels beyond the people already convinced is the whole ballgame. The zoning laws, the permitting burden, the cattle economics, none of that moves until enough people believe the impossible outcome is real. The Texas site is the proof. Whether it becomes the argument is still being decided.